Alright everyone, let's go over HTML tables and the basic CSS styling needed in order to properly develop them. In order to do that, we're going to need a little bit of free space, and this stuff is kind of not important anymore, so we're just going to get rid of it. Rather than deleting it all, I want to save it just in case I need to grab a button or an anchor for later on, and I'm going to be able to do that by highlighting everything, holding Control and pressing slash. This is a shortcut for Visual Studio Code that will comment out everything. In programming and markup languages, comments are considered characters that the recipient device ends up ignoring for compilers or browsers in this case. So when I go ahead and save this, Google Chrome, and every other browser as well for that matter, is going to see these leading comment characters and these trailing comment characters and pretend that they, along with everything inside of there, does not exist. Now that we've got some free space, we are ready to create our table. So the table tags are just table. There's no abbreviations for that. There are going to be a series of sub-elements that we have to designate that do use abbreviated tags. Those elements are the table row, which is TR, and table data, which is TD. Now, a table is similar to a spreadsheet or a grid in some sense, in that there are horizontal rows and vertical columns. The predominant element is going to be the row, so we have to designate the table row first. And then within the horizontal table row, we can designate chunks of data, which are called table data. You could think about them like columns, but you can't list out the entire column all at once. You have to list out the row and fill each column as you go from left to right, top to bottom. Let's go over an example of what that might look like. We're just going to put the capital letter A in here, and then we're going to create another table data. We're going to call this B. We'll do another table data after that. We'll call this one C. And now let's make one more table row. We're going to do D. We forgot to put this inside a table data. All right, so TD, capital D, delete that, TD, E, and TDF. Okay, so these go in order top to bottom, but they don't orient themselves that way on the page. This is going to give you a much better idea of how tables actually structure themselves. So let's hit save, and we've got A, B, C, D, E, F. Right? Now they're all going to be listed left to right, but because these are in separate table rows, they're broken. It's almost like a line break in some sense. Now, the reason that we need to learn CSS styling, or at least the basics, in order to properly work with tables is because we can't see any of the table rows or the table datas or anything like that other than the content within. There's no borders, there's no background colors or anything like that. And it's pretty difficult to work with unless you add those in using CSS. There are two different ways you can add CSS styling to HTML elements. The most simple way is by going into the HTML element opening tags and simply add the style attribute. It's going to be called style, followed by an equal sign and a pair of double quotes. Everything within the double quotes is going to be CSS styling that's applied to just this element. So we could add something like background dash color, and we'll do red, because red is a pre-built HTML color. We save it, and we can see that the table has turned red. Now, this can be cumbersome because if I make multiple tables, I'm going to have to specify this for every single table if I want them to be the same colors. And if I have borders I want to apply to these TD elements, that's going to be annoying to have to copy and paste the styling in for every single one of them, especially if I add more later on. So what we're going to be doing instead of adding the styles directly to the table or, well, the specific elements, we're going to be creating a pair of style tags up in the head. The style open and closing tags are going to designate the page styling. What's important to remember is that everything within these style tags is going to be read as if it's a CSS file rather than an HTML file, which means there's different syntax that you got to watch out for. So let's get started by making our table have a background color of red. We're going to start by stating the word table. That's going to designate all table elements on the page, followed by curly braces. Everything within the curly braces are the styling for that table. Let's do background dash color colon red semicolon, and we will save. Now we can see that our table is now red, even though we don't have any styling down here. What's cool about this is that this doesn't just apply to the one table we have now. If we make more tables in the future, this background color of red is going to apply to those too. Now that we've got some styling set up for the page, let's add some styling that'll make developing tables much easier. So we're going to give the table a border. It's going to be 1px, which stands for 1 pixel. That's the thickness of the border. We're going to call it solid, which is the type of border it is. You could do dashed, for example, if you wanted it to be broken down into like a dotted line. And then we're going to do black, just to make it a solid, thin black line. You can see there's this tiny, thin little black line surrounding the table. We could set this to something ridiculous like, 100 pixels if we wanted to. Now you can see it's a super thick border, but typically 1 pixel is more than enough. Now we want this to not only apply to the table itself, but also to the cells within the table. So we're going to do TD and add the exact same border there. So now we have a little border surrounding each of the different cells within our table. And it's going to expand and grow dynamically depending on the things we put in here. So let's go ahead and make this a little bit more filled out. I'm going to replace this with upper right. We're going to do lower left, lower right, and we'll just leave the centers. Well, we'll call it center. There we go. So it's a little bit cramped still, even with the borders, but we have our text in here, and we can see that the table changes based on what's inside of it. Let's add a little bit more styling now. We're going to do, actually, let's put this in the table cells. So there's a style called padding, which has to do with the amount of space it's going to put on the inside of its edges. So if we do padding, 8 pixels, you're going to see a lot of space between these words and the borders immediately surrounding it. Now we've got a little bit more space between the words in here and the walls of the cells. Padding could be thought of as the extra space on the inside of an element, whereas margins can be thought of as extra space on the outside of a given element. Now, table cells don't like the margin style. They pretty much ignore it, but we can add it to the table. So let's add margin, we'll do 16 pixels up here. We're going to see it move away from the elements above and to the left when I save it. So it's pushing itself away from the other things and just trying to get a little bit of extra space. Let's just add some padding to the table too, just to see how that looks. Now there's going to be a little bit of extra space on the inside of the table, pushing the rows and the cells closer together and expanding the table and keeping it all centered and even. So now that we can see what's actually going on in our table, let's try adding another row and inserting it in the middle here. So we're going to do middle left and middle right. We're going to do lower center. We're going to do upper center. And then we're going to do true center and save. So now we have 3 rows with 3 columns and all different data fields within. Tables can be a little bit confusing because of the way you have to lay them out. You have to stack them vertically as if you were reading from left to right. So we've got upper left, then it goes center, right, middle left, true center, middle right, lower left, lower center, lower right. It comes easier with some time, but it is definitely a bit confusing at first. Now that we've got a pretty good idea of what tables are and how they work more or less, along with the way we can style them, let's start fleshing this out and allocating the different sections that are going to be on our widget homepage. Tables are very good for laying things out in a grid format, and I think this is the perfect time to go over it. So we're just going to add a bunch of different styling. We're going to make the background a nice light gray instead. We want the margins to be 0. We want it to touch the edges, but we also want it to fill the whole screen. So we're going to add the width element, and instead of using pixels, we're going to be using 100%. that's going to stretch it all the way across and fill up as much of the space that it can. HTML has a lot of complex things going on with it, and it reads where other elements are and figures out where to put them, and it can measure how much space there is and then fill it if you tell it to. So we're also going to do height 100%. That's going to flesh it out all the way down to the very bottom here. Now the widget homepage header is actually getting in the way a little bit, so let's get rid of that. We want just the table. So now we've got a table that's stretching all the way to the top and all the way from left to right, filling the entire screen. This is good. We've got a nice 9-section grid that we can work with. So if you recall, the widget homepage is going to have a couple different things on it. Let's start allocating those. We're going to create another table cell up at the top here, so it's 4 across, and we're going to replace these with the titles of what's supposed to go in here. So the upper left is going to be Spotify, the one to the right of that is Medio Blue Weather. Next to that is going to be a Facebook feed, and on the far right we have Facebook groups. So now we can see that we've got these sections laid out on our table. This is, okay, here's a good point about tables. We've added 4 cells in the top row, but the other rows only have 3, and that's just going to leave this empty hanging space down here. So before we go over that, let's get rid of this very last row. So we only need 2 rows, and in the bottom, we only need 2 cells. Because on the very bottom left, we have Google Drive, and on the bottom right, we have Google Calendar. Saving that, these are only going to take up half the space because they're connected to these up here. This is where a particular attribute called colspan comes in handy. Colspan is something you can add to table data, table cell, and it's going to affect the number of columns that that particular cell takes up. So if we go in here and we type colspan 3 for Google Drive now takes up 3 columns, meaning that our table is full. Now we don't want it to take up 3 columns, we want to keep it 50-50 split. So we're going to add colspan 2 down here and change this one to 2 as well. Saving that, now our table is completely fleshed out, filled from left to right, top to bottom. We have 4 cells in the top row, 2 cells in the bottom row, and there's no empty spaces, no gaps or anything weird like that. Now we may have gotten rid of all the big gaps when it comes to table rows and cells, but if you look closely, and you probably don't have to look that close even, there are gaps between the borders of these cells, and that's going to shine through when we end up styling the backgrounds to have these fancy colors. I don't want that at all, so we're going to have to go up to the table and add a new style. Border collapse, and set it to collapse. That's going to make all of the little tiny spaces between the rows and cells just shrink and go away. And now the edge of this particular cell is the same edge that this cell is touching as well. Before we actually start styling these table cells to have cool background colors that are slightly transparent, let's go ahead and grab a cool image to make for the background of our entire page. We can go over to Google and just search for whatever you want. Image is probably fine. I like to use things that are legal for commercial use. So something like this, publicdomainpictures.net. You can open the image in a new tab, grab the URL, and bring it back on over here. So let's go up to the very top of the style tags and add the body. This is going to affect everything that, well, it'll affect the body element and subsequently everything within the body tags. So we're going to do a background dash image URL parentheses, paste in our URL. Let's add some single quotes just to be extra safe here. And we'll head on back here, save. And you can see it's in the background now, but let's go ahead and shine through everything. So we're going to take the table and change the background color to transparent. Now you can see that we've got this cool background image, but it's repeating because it's not big enough on its own to flesh out the entire page. We can close all that. We don't need it anymore. We have a couple other styles we're going to have to do. Background size, and we're going to use the word cover. That's going to stretch the image as far as it needs to fill it out both in width and height. Now, it's not going to compress it for the width. It's going to actually chop off whatever side is too long, but at least we're not getting repeating images. And I kind of like the way that this ended up pulling the left side of the image. We've got a nice little butterfly and a cool sort of sunburst flower going on here. That worked out kind of nicely. With that fancy little background in place, we can go ahead and start adding specific colors to the different table cells. Now we could add the colors right here, like background, color, and instead of just picking a color, we're going to use RGBA parentheses. Now these are going to contain RGB values. Uh, red, green, and blue is what RGB stands for. The A stands for alpha, and that's going to determine the level of opacity that you're dealing with here. And the values you can put in range from 1 to 255. So if we do 255, 255, 255, that's maxing out the red, the green, and the blue involved and setting it to white. So we'll go ahead and just put alpha to 1, fills it out, makes it completely white. RGB colors are pretty simple once you get the hang of it. Feel free to look into it more if you need a little bit more help on that. VSC actually has a color picker that allows you to not have to punch these in manually. So you could go ahead and hover over this and just select whatever color you want. Scroll it down to the greens and we'll just make that green. And we'll go ahead and see, now VSC is a little bit annoying because sometimes it'll remove the A and you have to add that back in manually, and the A is going to be important because it'll set the transparency. So we're going to do 0.5. So it's half solid color. Now, it's green, but you can see the other thing through it because it's half transparent. And we can change how transparent it is. We can set it to 1, and it's almost not even there. We could set it to 9, and, well, you can barely see through it at all. And that's going to determine how transparent or opaque it is. 1 is solid color, 0 is completely see-through. The other problem that we have with this little situation here is that this is applying colors to every single one of our table cells. All of these are going to be green, and I don't really want that. So we're going to just comment that out so we don't have it. But we are going to copy it and use it for the specific sections. So instead of applying styles that will impose themselves on every single element of a particular type, we want to add styles to individual elements. That's where we go into the element itself and add the style attribute. In here, we can post background color, RGBA, whatever style we want, and it's just going to affect this one element. And that's really convenient. Let's find a nice color for this Spotify green. We'll make it something like that, and we'll set the transparency to 0.4. Save. It's this nice soft little green color. We're going to do something similar for all the other ones as well. We'll make this one yellow. Got to paste these in to all of them first, of course. Now, these have the col span, so we just want to insert it before or after. HTML doesn't care about which order the attributes are listed, so both of these are completely fine. Col span before style, style before col span. Doesn't matter at all. Completely okay. Let's go ahead and add the specific colors for these now. Make this a softish yellow color, and make this a nice aqua blue, maybe a teal. This one's going to be a very rich blue, and we'll add maybe a purplish pink for this one. And then down here is going to be like a dark, rich purple. We'll just save all of that, and now we've got a a lot of different colors here. It kind of looks like a stained glass mural. That's kind of cool, actually. I'm not a fan of the way that Facebook Groups one looks. It's a little bit too dark. We need to make that slightly more blue. It's a little better. a little bit closer to this, but you can fine tune the colors as much as you want to make them exactly what you're looking for. But that's going to be essentially the tact that you have to take when you want to affect everything versus singular elements. One of the last things we want to do is get the text that's within these table cells all the way up to the top, make them bold, make them a little bit bigger, change the color to white, and put them in the center rather than left aligned. Now, we could try to figure out some CSS styling that might move these to the center, but there's actually a different kind of table cell you can put in that will automatically do that and make them bold. So we've been using TDs so far, but if we change this to TH instead and click save, you're going to see that the Spotify is now bold and it is moved into the center. Instead of standing for table data, TH stands for table header, and it's usually used for maybe a list of attributes that tell you what things you're going to see in the columns that come after. So we're just going to do a handy little control find replace for VSC. We're going to take all the TDs that exist and change them into THs, click replace all, hit save, and all of these are going to be bold and centered. I actually like the way that looks a little bit better. We probably could have started with that from the very beginning if I had a bit more foresight, but VSC makes it easy on us to make changes later on, so I'm very grateful for that. The other thing we got to do is make them all aligned to the very top. So we're going to use vertical align, and we're going to just put in top. It's going to move them all the way up here. We also want to make them white. So we're going to do color, and color is different than background color. Background color is going to flesh out all of the backdrop, so to speak, whereas color is affecting the text within. So color white, save. Now we've got our text that is white. It's still a bit small, and I'm not super fond of the font, so let's do font family, and we'll set it to, oh, I don't know, I kind of like monospace. A lot of people don't, but I've got a soft spot for it. And we will set font size to, we could use these pre-built ones like large or larger. I prefer using pixels, so let's do 32 pixels. That's a little too big. We'll do 28 maybe. It's going to be better. 32 should be fine actually. Once we stretch it all the way out, full screen, it should not be taking up everything. Now that we've gone over tables and basic styling, we've got a pretty good format layout here that we can use to start putting our widgets in. Now, finding widgets and embedding them in our HTML page isn't the most complicated thing in the world, but it can be very intimidating if you don't know what you're doing. I'm going to be walking you through all of that in the next episode.